Hello, welcome to CTG Weekly with Mark and Andre, a weekly podcast where we talk about whatever we want related to games. This week on the podcast, it's a hodgepodge as we talk about the Doom Eternal music controversy, what's happening with games on Twitter, and playing games through patch cycles. Andre.
Yes. Hi.
Hey. How's it going?
It's going great. I feel like the internet's melting down, but it's good for content.
The internet's melting down. Society is melting down. And we're gonna get to Twitter as the intersection of that in a second. But last night, what I encountered was a lovely statement released by Mick Gordon, the composer for Doom Eternal, which is a Bethesda IP. In regards to something that had happened 2 years ago
that's never good
on Reddit. Yeah. And then I think, so why am I starting this podcast with this? I think it's really important to understand all the different facets that go into producing a game. And, I think when we envision a game studio, if we picture such a thing at all, we have an idea in our mind of people sitting at computers, coding stuff, maybe dealing with concept art. But we lose sight of some of the minutia of what goes into a game being made, some of the politics that go into a game being made. And I think we lose track a little bit of the contract labor that goes into a game being made. And as a person who has spent most of my life doing short-term contract work, some of which has been music, but not all of it has been, this story really resonated with me. Have you heard about this at all? Are you completely fresh on this?
I mean, I've seen it pass me by tangentially, but I feel like I need a more in-depth explanation as much as the listeners do. So please.
Okay. I'm going to give a TLDR, and if you want to read this on your own, which you should, it's the statement released by Mick Gordon, the composer of Doom Eternal, takes 58 minutes to read. It does not say that it has been produced in conjunction with lawyers, but it is written such that it has been produced in conjunction with lawyers. And I'm just going to give a little summary of what this whole situation is. And so 2 years ago, one of the producers of Doom Eternal made, in response to some fan backlash about an original soundtrack for Doom Eternal not being released, they made a Reddit post that blamed Mick Gordon, the composer, for a failure to deliver on said soundtrack. In the wake of that, it was reported that Reddit users doxed Mick Gordon and his family. They received some threats, and apparently this was somewhat hard to verify, but was circulating in certain circles, that Mick Gordon contacted the moderators of the subreddit in order to try and shut that behavior down as this was happening. And Mick Gordon was actually himself banned from the subreddit in that moment. And so that's the starting point of this. And what has happened now, 2 years later, we get this 58-minute document that is enormous and basically lays out that what Bethesda did was contract Mick Gordon out for a certain amount of minutes of game sound. When you're producing game sound, there's this back and forth where it's an iterative design, right? Where you're producing tracks for scenes, for levels, for video scenes, cutscenes, and you send them to the team, they review it, and they give you feedback, and you're not paid for that, right? You're paid for the final. And so a lot of that material is rejected, although it's rejected with the idea that the rejection is so that we get a final product that we want, and within the pay scale that we have offered you for the amount of minutes you're giving us, as the end result, like, this is just part of the process, and that should all fit into this. He outlines that a couple things had happened here, which is they gave him a really tight timeline, and he was asked to compose music for levels that weren't complete yet. And so he was basically using raw ideas from his mind, imagining what the pace of the game would be. And if you've ever scored to video, or if you've watched a movie, you understand the music cuts to picture in particular ways to emphasize action. And in the Doom franchise, it's really important, right? Like the original Doom reboot game was so noteworthy for the mix of music and motion together. And in this instance, he was asked to compose blind effectively. And so there were several instances where his music was rejected. He was asked to put forth new music, and on top of that, so the original soundtrack for a product doesn't work the same way. It's not encapsulated in those minutes. That's its own separate contract that you have to do. They announced that they were going to release a soundtrack for Doom Eternal before they had ever signed a contract with Mick Gordon, the composer, and they did it on a very short timeline. And all throughout this, there were some bad faith interactions between the company and Mick Gordon about how they could possibly resolve this conflict. With Mick Gordon really trying to be like, the parameters set here are not good. Work with me so we can set this up. I think the one thing that I think is emblematic of this entire situation is that at the end of the day, in addition to them just going 8 months without paying him and then 9 months without paying him, like standard contract labor stuff that is, if you've done contract work, I've probably experienced, although that is a substantially larger gap in a pay period than I have experienced on any of my contracts, thankfully. But in addition to that, what they did was when the game finally released, they used a bunch of the rejected music material that is not supposed to be in the game because it was not accepted as paid minutes. They used something like, I have the exact number. They used 286 minutes of his recorded music, and they only contracted him for 142 minutes of music. And so they basically paid him for half of what they ended up using in the game.
Alternatively, some might argue that they stole a full soundtrack's worth of contract work.
Yeah. There's a lot more to this, and again, just read the report for yourself. It's very comprehensive, and it's oftentimes these kind of pieces come out where you're like, well, we have to hear both sides. There's a lot of documentation and proof in this article that makes me really believe that this is a pretty accurate depiction of what went down.
Wow.
Although, again, always reserve the right to say that it is not. And also, you can always go back and view that original post that threw Mick Gordon under the bus effectively for them failing to deliver on the soundtrack. It is of a vastly different genre than what Mick Gordon put out in defense of himself. It is very
interesting,
angry, and I think it was designed to rile up people, and it did. And I think that had a very negative impact on Mick Gordon and his family. And yeah, that's part of the industry.
Well, so this is horrendous, and kind of we didn't talk about this before, prepping show notes, but there's a very similar affair unfolding currently in another studio at, wouldn't you guess it, Activision Blizzard.
Oh, really? I've completely missed this. Please fill me in.
Yeah, so the person involved is the game composer and movie composer Sarah Skachner. So for some folks might have heard her work in, she's been scoring Ubisoft, Activision, and EA games for close to a decade now. She's worked on AC Unity as a co-composer. She was the main composer for Assassin's Creed Origins and a co-composer for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. She also was the composer for Anthem, the now defunct EA game. And she's been composing for Activision on COD for Infinite Warfare, Modern Warfare, and Modern Warfare 2. And a lot of people really like her soundtracks. She's also done more recently some movie scoring as well. So she scored Prey, the Predator movie from
Oh,
this year.
amazing. Yeah.
So she puts out an enormous amount of work, I think, in multiple industries, and a lot of fans were asking, when can we expect the Modern Warfare 2 soundtrack, which had not been released but had been, I mean, the music had been circulating in the game and online for a couple months now. And on October 27th, Sarah Skachner tweeted that she was thanking fans, but that she had no control over these things, and quote, "It would be out now if it were up to me." And then a
Ah.
week later, on November 3rd, she released a picture of a text that effectively tells fans that she can no longer continue to compose music for Modern Warfare 2 or Warzone, that the working dynamic with the audio director has become increasingly challenging, verbatim, and that she doesn't have any control over how the music is presented in game, and that what's going to be released is not her artistic intent in regards to mixing and mastering.
Yeah.
Quote, Mike Dean was a part of the creative vision of the album, as well as mixer Frank Wolf. We have soundtrack masters in hand from Mike, which you will never get to hear. And thanking musicians who had collaborated on this. And so this is very much, I think, sort of where you might position the early part of the Mick Gordon affair, where like we might be learning in a couple of years exactly what's happening with this. This is probably overdetermined by a bunch of NDAs and
Yes, of
contracts that
course.
aren't gonna let people speak out about what's happening. But it's pretty bad when you get to the point where an award-winning game composer publicly states that they can no longer continue to produce work for you, and that the work that will be coming out is not their artistic intent.
Yeah.
Uh, that's real bad.
I mean, there's that, and I mean, it's also the combo here of there's the artistic element, and then there's the are you actually being paid for the amount of labor and artistic energy that goes into producing something like this? Because part of the thing that you don't see are all the email chains that are disruptive to artistic flow and your production capability when you're making any kind of art, really.
Yeah.
And I producing music for a game can be one person sitting down at a MIDI controller, but often it's not. It's often collaboration with tons of musicians, with tight booking, to get those musicians in a studio space in a set amount of time to make sure a lot of stuff is done well. And these people are working miracles, and I know a lot of folks really love game music. And in the upcoming podcast we're gonna do this week for Have You Played, music plays a big part in my enjoyment of that game.
Yep.
And I think aside from maybe some very key figures in music, and this is true of film as well, folks probably aren't credited enough for the amount of work and the incredible artistic contributions that are being made to these media. But
Yeah.
I kind
It's
of just wanted to
brutal.
foreground that here on the wake of me reading that article and being a big music guy myself and thinking like, man, it's I'm always somewhat mournful I didn't really get into music professionally. Like I took a different road, but then at the same time I see this and I was like, well, if I had done this, maybe this is actually just where I would have landed anyway.
Always always like that you refer to yourself as kind of a big music guy when you own like multiple instruments and were a touring musician for years, which is you're not like a big music guy, you were a professional musician for years.
Yeah, but it's weird though because it's not in the same way, and I have that
That's
indie
fair.
spirit, which is which is a very different kind of way of producing. Even though I've adapted more to the digital age that we live in now, where you can to some degree fake a lot of instrumentation. You're not faking it; you are playing it, and you're using sounds in really creative and expressive ways. But it's it always feels slightly different to me. And again, I'm not in these days living on the ground in the same way, where once in a while I get to collaborate with people to, make game music for my friends, or for, small clips for podcasts like these. But it's not even close to the same. But my heart is with these folks. It really is. And when I read that, I was moved and enraged, and thus had to foreground this on the podcast today, because it's just one of many kind of inexcusable ways that we are dealing with game music and music in general, is this kind of, I don't know, disposable or like auxiliary component, when, like, I don't know, the entire Final Fantasy series is so like that. All those songs live with you, I mean, God of War, which just came out, it's not carried by the music, but if it wasn't there and if it wasn't just right, you'd know. And I think Doom especially exemplifies that. I don't know. Moving on to other sweet chaos.
Yeah, pay your employees.
Yeah. The
Really
TLDR: pay your employees. Not even just pay your employees. Treat people nice. Like, come
Fair.
on. Come on. That's really what this is. If you treat people nice, you're probably going to make sure you're paying your employees, and not developing a method for extracting most of their product from them without paying them. We can do better. All right. Speaking of ways that we cannot do better.
Oh, I'm up now.
Yeah, you're up,
Great.
sir.
So we're talking about the impact of, how do I put this delicately?
The Musk
change in
era?
leadership of Elon Musk at Twitter. So for folks who are not following this, and maybe you aren't, Twitter is undergoing some very rapid and complicated changes in terms of infrastructure, payment model, functions on both the users and also mass layoffs and restructuring on the production side. But one of the big things that's been coming out of this is that verification is changing, right? So Twitter has a system that's been in place for many, many years, which is the blue verified check, where the idea is that if people are verified, you're aware that you are speaking to or seeing the posts of the person who is verified in some fashion. Often these are like corporate run accounts, but they are representative or sanctioned by that as the official sort of team, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you're seeing something like, I don't know, the Ben Affleck checkmark account, it might not be Ben Affleck, but it's probably his publicist, and it is like the official point. Whereas if you see Ben Affleck accounts that do not have that checkmark, they're probably fan accounts or parody accounts in some fashion. And in his infinite wisdom, new Twitter aficionado and owner Elon Musk has decided to do away with the check as a verification mark, to, quote, make it for the people, by charging everyone $8 for the check mark, but it not being sort of an authentication model like it was before. Now, you may ask yourself, well, what's stopping me from making an account of someone else, paying that $8 and becoming verified, but not being the official account? And the answer is really nothing, because that's what's been happening for game studios for the past 48 hours or so. In fact, there was someone who purchased the Nintendo of America. I think it's the Nintendo of America, or it might just be the default Nintendo account for Twitter, paid the $8, and started tweeting images of Mario giving the finger to audiences.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I saw that one.
It is Nintendo of America. I'm correct. People have started doing this with politics as well. So, for example, somebody made a parody account of George W. Bush and posted some really messed up stuff. Apparently, this has also been happening to Valve. And it is leading to two things that are like immediate outcomes of this. One, it's devaluing brand curation on the platform extensively, where companies are now fighting against the system to not be devalued. So, for example, like Nintendo's brand is being family friendly. Obviously, images of Mario flipping off people is not
Yeah.
conducive to their brand, especially if kids see it. Although, if kids are on Twitter, that in itself is already not the best situation, but it's 2022. The other part of this is that these accounts are being marketed by the Twitter algorithm above the actual old verified accounts. And so in the case of Valve, it's easier to find the sort of bootleg posts than it is to find Valve's actual posts on the platform, which is going to lead to a deluge of fake accounts burying legitimate accounts beneath a sheen, and users just aren't going to have the time or the energy to go find original posts and are just going to leave the platform. Now, this has already, I mean, you can read up on what's happening at Twitter, the thousands of people that have been laid off, including engineers and people who are experts in this. The accounts that like Musk is trying to recoup his investment by sort of selling Twitter off for parts and heavily monetizing it in predatory ways and selling off your data. Like those are all discussions that are, I think, important, but are not specifically about games. What I'm interested in today is how this impacts the game industry. And one of the things that it does is, well, it really hampers the ability of companies to use social media to market their product. A good example of this, if people want to go see, um, I think the author's name is Louis Tan, who did stats analysis on Cult of the Lamb and Cult of the Lamb's use of Twitter to grow its user base and its revenue exponentially since its initial announcement to great effect, which is something that is very hard to do for indie developers who would, for example, only be using the distribution platforms that they're on. Stuff like, the Steam sort of like catalog that shows you games every day. I cannot remember the queue that recommends you stuff, or Xbox and PlayStation stores, or even the Epic Store. Like those are fairly limited. And so the importance of social media is really felt more for smaller publishers who don't have brand loyalty or established series that people are already following from major announcements.
Right.
And so all this stuff is once again going to be hitting smaller studios that require Twitter to be functional on one end, because those people aren't going to be able to use it reliably, and on the large end, it's going to produce an enormous amount of misinformation about larger brands that have a big following. Um, you know, I really don't want to veer into this, but like I could very easily foresee in the next 72 hours people starting to make extremist political accounts that are parodies of specific large studios that might be seen to be too woke or left wing as a form of harassment, right?
Yeah.
This is
There's a
like,
lot of possibilities for this.
yeah, none of it good, really.
No. I mean,
Um,
really none of it good, because like the best option for a small developer now, if you actually want to try and get some more visibility, is to give Elon Musk $8, which is also not not an enticing prospect.
I mean, I suspect that what's going to be happening is that because companies are finding this unreliable, advertisers are reported to start leaving the platform, which is going to reduce monetization and influx for ad revenue for the company, which means that like we may in fact be at an early stage of like a death spiral of Twitter in terms of user base and economic viability, which means like this might go a lot faster than people are expecting it to go,
Yeah.
especially for businesses. And that's really hard because the games industry is so segmented now, especially since we don't have unified trade events anymore. Like we had Summer Games Fest, but it's no longer what E3 was 10 years ago, where you would like people would turn on their screen that 1 week of the year and they would know everything that was coming out for the rest of the year. There's just too much game development.
Yeah.
Discoverability is a massive problem for studios, especially if they're from underserved locales or if they're in different languages that aren't English. It's necessary to have these sort of digital paper trails for users to be able to find the content, find images, share it with other people. If these systems don't work, it is going to have a negative impact until the industry resettles. And let's be honest, large studios are going to resettle much faster than small ones are on this.
Yeah, and generally, just the world we are presently living in is not one that settles very well. Even thinking about moving to Mastodon as an alternative, which is one of the things that has been brought up in more localized circles of where do we go from Twitter? We go to Mastodon. Well, Mastodon's way more segmented. It's a server-based system, a la Discord, although there is slightly more findability. That's not
Yeah.
really a great locale to settle for this context, and it does produce a certain amount of siloing as well, which if you want to kind of avoid that anywhere, except in instances where you really need to protect yourself. But in terms of like a market or open idea space, that's probably not really where we want to be either.
Right.
Yeah.
I also suspect that, like many of these platforms, uptake is generationally very different. Like different generations adapt at different speeds. They prefer different platforms. And so right now I mean, we haven't talked about this, but like Facebook is also imploding, and that's taking away like a segment that is not negligible. Like in terms of live streaming stats, like Facebook gaming did account for a significant chunk. It is number 3, I think, on the digital game streaming stuff. So if Facebook goes and Twitter goes, it is kind of a shutdown of those services, and it also puts increased decision power and like advertising power in the hands of platforms that are going to be left behind. So Twitch, right?
Yep.
Twitch is going to become even more important for marketing and promoting your game through the labor of streamers. And it's an interesting shift. Like I'm generally not very happy with what's happening with Twitter, despite my issues with the platform broadly. But like this is impacting tens of thousands of people who depend on Twitter for their livelihood, whether they're in the games industry part or in the tech part that is making services and API and designing tools for Twitter. All of these people are feeling this burn.
Yeah, and it's we're talking about games here, but I mean, you can just apply literally everything that was just said to many different other industries and small creators or smaller businesses, if we want to use that rhetoric, that use that platform. Like
I mean, to contextualize this, it wasn't that long ago that we had seated president of the United States using Twitter as a primary communication mode.
I don't remember this. No.
Yeah, unfortunately. But originally, like the point of the platform was also to give an extremely fast access to critical infrastructural information, such as like fire departments giving out like calls about like forest fires and wildfires developing in an area, or it has been used by police to tell people to shelter in place. What happens when someone makes a verified account on the behalf of a police department that's not the actual police department tweeting out stuff?
I was about to say, can I be a verified fire department that is just like evacuate now? Like, is this an actual possibility that can happen today?
Yeah, it can happen today. And apparently, so this is the if you really want to Twilight Zone it. So the response to removing verification like this was that, well, how are you able to determine what's verified? Well, apparently, and I'm not sure if this has gone through, there was double verification. So you could get the check, but you would have to click on the account, and beneath the account, when you were on the account page, it would say verified account on top of having the check, which is not the same as account verification because we really live in the dumbest timeline.
Well,
I wish oligarch mine owners would stop fucking with my online platforms because I'm very tilted right now.
I'm gonna one up you there. I wish oligarch mine owners would just stop. I think we'll leave that discussion there, and we'll talk about the games that we're talking about this week. But we're not talking about any specific game this week because Andre and I both are kind of living in this zone at the moment where we are tumbling through a bunch of different games that are simultaneously going through patch cycles.
Correct.
Yeah. And for listeners who don't know, what is a patch cycle? Well, games in the games of service era are constantly updated through a form of cyclical development through patches that are released that change core factors of the games. And we play a lot of games as service games. Right. And so we are living through multiple patch cycles at once. And they are leaving us in states of elation and turmoil.
Yeah. So basically what's been happening on my end is that since we last talked, I'm still playing some of the same games. I've kind of dropped Marvel Snap, so I'm not going to be talking about that one. But I've gone back to checking out Legends of Runeterra a little bit. I'm still playing Destiny. I've been keeping an eye on the upcoming expansion for Path of Exile. And all of these games either have just had patches, are having patches imminently, or are having announcements about when they will reveal the design intention for patch notes that we'll be releasing. And so we are now in a sort of hype cycle for the announcement of patches.
Yeah.
Which is like a third order level of like keeping people engaged despite the game not being in a state where people are having fun. Because generally the traditionally in the 90s, the purpose of patches was really to solve technical issues. And we didn't get that many. You would get because games were offline, often you wouldn't get patches at all, or you would maybe get 1 or 2 patches or something like that. Now we really are in a mode of like, well, every month or so, games get patches. And some are more for technical purposes, like bug fixes, and some are game balance patches. And I think one of the things, especially in card games, that we talk about is meta disruption. So the purpose of the patch is not to make the game better, but it's to shake up the current configuration of the game and to allow for different play styles, different play opportunities, different locales. And that keeps people coming back to the game that you're talking about, right? I don't know. What's your feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, my feel's the same. Although, I mean, for card balance, I'm not playing Runeterra. I stick with Magic, and they don't do a ton of balance patches. Although you could, theoretically consider that any new set release is in itself a patch to the game. But we're not gonna go through that here. I'm presently playing Destiny 2 and World of Warcraft as my main 2 games, both of which are going through patch cycles right now. In World of Warcraft, it's a tumultuous time because we're 3 weeks out from the newest expansion, and in the lead up to the new expansion, there is always every 2 weeks or so some kind of balance change. And this is the time when players are trying to figure out their new classes, what they want to bring into a new expansion over a long term. And it's really difficult to find any solid ground when the patch cycle is so frequent, because a class that looked very promising a week ago now looks terrible, as I talked about last week, where I was going to play a shaman, and it it got hit pretty hard in those patch notes, and so it didn't seem like it was going to be a rewarding prospect, even though it was still slightly overperforming. They they may tune it down even more, right? And so it's hard. I think this is the issue with this kind of cycle, which is like it builds hype and it creates new re-engagement into your product, but it also feels like you're never really secure or satisfied in the game that you're playing. Like it never feels like you're in the hands of people who are like, it's we're going to make sure if this is what you like in the game, we're going to make sure it's at least okay. And the general design philosophy is kind of, it's okay if this isn't good for this time, because maybe
Right.
later, and it might be 2 years later, it might be 6 patches later, where it's like it'll have its time again. But I don't know, and it's very in line with like the gig economy world a little bit, where uh we just, even in our leisure, even in our play, everything feels so shaky and
Yeah.
disruptive.
So I can give you the example of the two main games that I've been checking out for this because it's been such a fascinating contrast. So Runeterra, we talked a bit about the patch cycle and like how long it can take a couple weeks back.
Yeah.
But one of the things that happened was new expansion released with a bunch of new cards, and many of them were way too strong and had a lot of randomness, and people weren't happy with them. And they realized that before the next big tournament, which is Worlds in this case, there was going to be a Worlds patch. And so people just said, well, if the tournament patch is different from the current patch, then none of the decks I'm playing actually matter. And there's no seasonal tournament, so there's no seeding to play for. There's no reason to play competitive. And so I'm just not going to play until the next patch releases. And so population tanked. Anecdotally, streams that I was watching that were about 500, 600 people dropped to about 300. Runeterra doesn't have a high live streaming base anyways.
Right.
It's a bit more on YouTube. Card games in general have that aside from Hearthstone. But last Friday, they announced the patch notes, and they actually like did a pre-announcement for the patch note where they just kind of show you an icon and the name of a card that will either be the subject of a nerf or a buff. So they put it on buff or nerf side of the infogram, but they don't tell you what's coming up. And so they're kind of like, there's a pre-patch
Oh
to the
no.
patch where people are like, so this thing I like is going to get hit, and I'm going to hate the game coming up next week. So people may play less or more depending on that. Then the patch notes are released Tuesday, and so Tuesday is kind of a dead zone because people are either sometimes testing. I know some Worlds competitors were testing ahead of time because they were like, I have to get in as much practice as possible. I have to figure out, the new tech before we go in. And then the patch fully releases, and now you're in the new discovery phase. But it's so actively shut down the player base when people felt like the game was not in a good state. Path of Exile is having something very similar. So they work on a 13-week cycle, is their seasonal model, and they usually release like 3 smaller expansions and 1 larger expansion around the holidays as kind of like their big shakeup expansion. And what they do beforehand is they give a timeline of the announcements. So they tell you when they're going to tease what the league is about and when the manifesto is coming in. Then you get the manifesto, and the manifesto is like an essay form describing at a philosophical level what changes they're going to be implementing, which will be documented in the patch notes numerically. And so there's like a piece of time when people are trying to figure out like, okay, does greatly decreased mean this percentage or this other percentage? Like, is it less good, or is it just gone from the game functionally, or is this thing that I wanted to play for a very long time good now?
Right.
And then there's a sort of like overhauling, pieces of defense, skill groups, like all fire skills. Like there's a bunch of stuff that they toy around with. And the patch notes come out a week before the expansion. Now, it used to actually be like 3 days before, where people have all the information in hand to start considering what kind of characters they want to play for the upcoming game. Unfortunately, the game has not been in a great state. So last I saw, the concurrent Steam player numbers were the lowest they've ever been since the game has been tracking on Steam, which means that aside from very early releases, this is like the lowest player count that the game has seen since 2016, 2015.
It's not a good place to be.
Um, it's been very bad. They also took about 3 consecutive seasons of releasing almost no new skills and barely any skill balance, which is for one of the parts that I really like is, well, I've wanted to play this spell or this attack for years and it hasn't been good, but now it's good all of a sudden, so I'm going to play it. That stuff hasn't been happening at all. The leagues have been very small. And so we just got an announcement of when the manifesto is going to be and what topics are going to be. And one of the Reddit comments on the thread was, I don't think I've ever seen people downvote so hard for the announcement of an announcement of patch notes. People are preemptively so angry because the games are going in a bad direction, or in a direction that they don't like, that even just being told that these will be addressed in patch notes to them reads like, well, they're going to destroy another thing that I like about this game, and it's irreparable. And so I think patch notes are actually having a negative impact, or they're acting like a multiplier on the game state if the game is good or bad. Like when
Right.
Elden Ring was going well and we heard that there was going to be a patch, well, our initial thought wasn't going to be they're going to destroy all the weapons I love. It was they're going to fix the things that are a bit too strong and they're going to make a lot of other stuff viable, which has generally been what has actually happened. There was a recent patch that is an exception to that. However, in these games that are not doing well, the idea is, well, the patch notes are going to make everything worse. Like them patching, they haven't been patching it well, and so they should just stop touching it. Destiny is in a bit of a weird middle spot where like some parts of the patch are really liked and some parts are really disliked, but they're very transparent about percentage buffs that are coming in like a month and a half.
Yeah, I'll jump in
Um,
here on Destiny there because I want to talk about another kind of thing that these patch cycles do and how they're impacting me. Because right now I'm playing largely, almost entirely actually, as part of a community that is its own little Discord community that is built around positivity, and it's far and away the best time I've had in any multiplayer game in recent memory. Keep in
mhm.
mind that I study multiplayer games for my life, like my living. This is what I do, and this is the first time I've actually been like, oh, I'm actually having like a really nice, friendly time. And part of this is that the community is built to be this way, but it's also built around Destiny. It's built around Destiny 2, right? And the thing that I've seen over the past couple weeks is that there's been this general feeling that Destiny 2 is not really in a good place right now. This happens most seasons, where in the last few weeks of a season of the game, which the seasons are the larger patches, where the start of a season is where the big stuff comes in, and then there's a few patches throughout. Near the back end of a season, the changes are usually fairly minor and players lose momentum, right? And that's a thing. That's part of why these patches exist and why these hype cycles for patches exist, because it keeps you interested, or possibly has this negative effect where if the game is not going well, you kind of anticipate disaster and are even less interested in the game. But what's happened is that this community, this really remarkable space that I currently find myself in, uh, without any like internalized drama or these really intense moments of like things are going bad. It's just there are now less players there because the game is not as good, or it doesn't feel as good to play anymore. And so the players who are sticking around are the ones who are playing purely for that positive space, right? And so to do like any kind of community project that is like, we're going to try and elevate, or we're going to try and carve out a culture in this game space that's a bit more welcoming, that's just a bit better than you get on average through like random matchmaking, or if you use like default systems, that whole architecture crumbles if the patch cycle isn't good, because you're losing players, right? You're losing players who are inclined to feel like they want a nice, positive community, but who also want to play a game that they feel good playing, right? And so I'm just watching like the supports for this community kind of fall through no fault of its own. It's just, for this to work, the game has to be good, and players have to have a lot of confidence that changes are coming, and the changes that are coming are going to be good. So it's this really, really tense balancing act between community folks and the developers of the game, not just to make social systems, but to make sure just general gameplay patch notes are good.
Yeah. It's interesting too. So the lead developer for Path of Exile gave a GDC talk a couple of years back called something akin to designing a game meant to be played forever, and sort of settling into the service idea of games and graphing it, like showing what your player numbers look like at a holistic level between years around this cycle. And the idea was, the beginning of a season or a new patch brings an incredible spike in returning players and new players, and that peters out back to basically what it was before the patch by the end of this patch cycle, because people are burnt out or tired, and so they expect that there will be new content coming in soon, because that's the promise of the service model. And that over time, these spikes have been getting more and more extreme. Like the highs are higher, but the lows are as low as they've ever been, which
Right.
means that like your drop off is extremely high. But really, what they're targeting is new players added in the first 3 or 4 days of one of these patch cycles, which are new customers. They buy more product. They might buy microtransactions, and so the the funny part is, we can't peek behind the curtain at like the finances of these companies, but I am curious, like, you know, if you have a system where people are playing all the time, and there's very little change from these patches, and so you're kind of incentivized to spread out your gaming habits over time, you know, what does that look like from a company standpoint versus this sort of extremely strong funnel of new content and hype in the first like 48 hours of a season, which is sort of like, that's the Path of Exile model. The sort of more weekly model is a bit more the what Bungie's doing with Destiny, but it is leading to burnout anyways. Like, yeah, you have 10 weeks over which the story content of a season is taking place out of the 15 weeks that the season's launching, but like by season 10 you've already lost a bunch of people, and those people might just come back at the end of a season, knock out all the stuff that they have to do in like a day or two, prepping for the new stuff to come in. It's really interesting. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into evaluating how the patch cycle is interacting with the player base, I think at a granular level that's specific to each game's systems.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, like, I and I can only speak for myself, it feels like homework. I feel like I have to do game homework for all these games to not miss out on this content before it cycles out and new stuff comes in that I'm supposed to be excited about, but like maybe I'm burnt out and I don't want to be doing it. Like,
This is
there's
especially
not
true for the really multiplayer focused competitive, or even if you're doing cooperative content that is like, you require other people. People expect you to be updated, and they will let you know if they feel like you don't know what you're doing, right? You there's a constant need to uh reinform yourself on every new detail in these games, so that you make sure you are not at the mercy of people who are going to to call you out for maybe not doing a thing or not knowing that a thing now works this way, or people are going to be like, why are you using this gun in Destiny, for example, because now it's absolutely terrible. Or even you'll just be having a bad time because you'll come back to the game after a year. There will have been 3, 4, 5, 6 patches, and you'll equip the gun that you played a year ago. And it's actually just useless and shooting fireworks now, or whatever is happening, right? Like, it's a thing.
Yeah.
The more you know. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about this before we close?
No, I think this is it, and I think I want to leave off by saying, despite the fact that I seem a bit down, I am very much excited for the upcoming Destiny season, which is starting early December, which is a new patch. More than I am for every other game, but really I am excited to pick up some premium product games, such as the new God of War, and to not have to deal with this, to just play it on my terms, and when I'm done, I'm done.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm so looking forward to Midnight Suns for that. This is a game I can sink my teeth into, and I don't have to worry about anybody else, and that's gonna be nice. So that's it for this week. We will see you next time on CTG Weekly. Bye bye.
Bye.